This presentation is brought to you by American Civil War and UK history. This is the Figures of the American Civil War podcast. If you're watching on YouTube and you like what you see, remember to give us a big thumbs up. And remember to hit that subscribe button. And all the links to our website, podcasts and social media pages can be found in the podcast description. Hello, I'm your host Daz, and joining me once again is historians Dr. Nathan Provost and Tim Willging to discuss Ulysses S. Grant. In this episode, we discuss Grant's involvement in the Western Theatre, from his re-enlistment and everything in between, right up to the middle part of the Vicksburg Campaign. This is the Figures of the American Civil War podcast, Ulysses S. Grant, Episode 2, The Western Theatre, Part 1. Hello everyone and welcome to the podcast. Welcome Tim.
Hey, how are you?
And welcome Nathan.
Hey, how's it going?
We're going to jump straight into it. How does war break out across the United States? What events lead up to it? So Nathan, we'll come to you, please.
Yeah, well, thanks again for having us on here. But just to kind of start off here with how the war breaks out, just as a brief overview, the election of 1860 was arguably the most pivotal election in United States history. And there were four candidates. You had John Bell of the Constitutional Unionist Party, Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democratic Party, John Breckinridge of the Southern Democratic Party, and then, of course, we all know Abraham Lincoln of the Republican Party. And it's pretty well known that Grant largely supported Stephen Douglas, and the reasoning behind that is, he thought that was the best option so the United States wouldn't fracture or break apart. It was this somewhat of a moderate or middle ground option, and just as a reminder, Grant would not define himself as an abolitionist at this point in time. So Stephen Douglas is someone that believes largely in letting state sovereignty, them deciding if they should have slavery in that territory or not. That was Stephen Douglas's viewpoint. But anyway, Lincoln will actually end up winning the election. Stephen Douglas, I actually think, only ends up winning Missouri, but that's not too surprising, considering I believe that was actually his home state. But Lincoln is because he gets elected, you start seeing the deep southern states secede from the United States, and Lincoln is going to call up 75,000 volunteers, and then of course you're going to have more states leave the United States, like Virginia, right? So there's an issue with the Union-controlled forts in the South, like Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And the Confederate States of America, they demanded the Union to remove its soldiers from those forts because obviously now they consider that a part of the South. But Fort Sumter will continue to receive supplies from the North, and it's eventually going to be fired upon by Confederate forces, which ultimately leads to the outbreak of the war.
Awesome, thank you. And so this is the question, and this one's for Tim. Where is Grant at the start of the American Civil War, and how does he get back into the army?
Okay, so at the start of the Civil War, Grant is back in Galena, Illinois. His father ran a tannery there. He had relocated from St. Louis area to Galena in April of 1860. And basically he worked for his father as a clerk. He was there with his younger brothers, Simpson and Orville, really focusing on his financial stability, getting himself out of debt that he had accrued since he got out of the Army a few years earlier. So he was basically living a, small town American life 1860. Well, when the war started, Grant offered himself up to the War Department to re-enter the Army. Never heard anything to go back in the regular Army. At the same time, he attended mass meeting to assess the crisis in his own town. He actually would attend a couple of recruitment meetings and was offered a captaincy, but having been a captain in the regular Army and the Army getting bigger through the introduction of all these volunteers and being a West Point graduate, he clearly felt like he deserved a higher ranking position. He served as an aide-de-camp, basically an acting adjutant general in essentially a civilian capacity as a mustering officer for the governor of Illinois, until he was able to eventually, using that connection, obtain the colonelcy of the 21st Illinois, I believe, 21st Illinois Volunteer Infantry, about 2 months after the war started in June of 1861. So he began as a regimental commander, not like many other officers, especially, civilian officers who this was really their first military experience. And that's essentially how he got back into uniform.
Okay, so obviously I know you mentioned his rank there, but where does he get posted once he gets himself established back in the U.S. Army?
He's essentially training troops there in Illinois. They'll move back and forth basically across the Mississippi River into Missouri, but he's really as a regimental commander serving in Illinois and Missouri. Just a couple months after he's, appointed in August with the aid of Senator Elihu Washburn, who was always, one of his biggest advocates. He was appointed a Brigadier General of Volunteers and was posted by the major commander in the federal commander in the West, John C. Fremont, a former Republican presidential candidate, I think in 1856. Appointed Grant as commander of the District of Southeast Missouri. And that encompassed basically everything from essentially across from Quincy, which is in the west central Illinois, the Hannibal, Missouri area where Mark Twain grew up, down to the southern border of Missouri, which included it was basically down to Columbus, which lay opposite of Paducah, Kentucky.
Okay, awesome. So you mentioned Paducah there, and Paducah, Kentucky is the first engagement that Grant's involved in. So Nate, tell us a little bit about the movement in Paducah, Kentucky, please, mate.
Right. So just a bit of context here and a few things to note. Grant is operating largely in the state of Missouri. And the reason for that is it has more to do with the fact that Missouri is a border state. So it remains a part of the Union, but it does allow for slavery. And so there is a lot of contention in the state between the people living there, and the Confederates are already trying to establish a foothold in Missouri as well. So early on, Grant is trying to push out these, Confederate guerrilla forces down further south because he can't operate in Kentucky. And the reason why is Kentucky is it's neutral. It doesn't belong to the north or south. It takes up this role of Switzerland. And basically the state government said whoever invades us first is who we're going to go to war against. Okay, so this move by Grant is probably is one of his most impressive feats of the war, because there's not a battle, there's not an engagement there, but it's this brilliant action that is called upon based upon intelligence that is not quite true. So Grant had already established a very solid intelligence system in Missouri because he had to figure out where these Confederate forces are. Okay, so basically what ends up happening is you have a guy by the name of Charles de Arnaud who will arrive at Grant's headquarters on the 5th of September, 1861. He's going to report to Grant that the enemy is marching in large force to take Paducah on the Ohio River, and they're going to invade southern Illinois. Okay, and of course, whether this intelligence was actually accurate or not meant little to Grant, because Grant is going to immediately realize the strategic and operational importance of Paducah. Okay, the city is located right on the confluence of the Ohio and Tennessee rivers, and the Confederate occupation of Paducah would threaten all Union positions. Okay, so Paducah is also going to offer the Union certain advantages as well. One advantage would actually be the control of the Tennessee River. The Tennessee River provided access to both armies, the occupation of the Mississippi River Valley, and access to central Tennessee as well. It will also bypass Forts Henry and Donelson, and it's going to allow access as far south as Alabama. So Grant is actually going to take on this intelligence as accurate and move his forces into Paducah, successfully occupying Paducah and bringing Kentucky in to the Union side, telling them that the Confederate forces are invading you. Okay, so this movement to Paducah was quite frankly pure genius on the part of Grant. It was just a masterpiece on his part. And this is very early in the war. This is before any, really major battles take place. Very, very key moment for Grant.
Mm-hmm. And does this bring him into the spotlight as far as other commanders and the people that are observing the war are concerned?
Well, it doesn't. I mean, I don't know if it brings in the attention of, most importantly, Abraham Lincoln. However, I will say that he does do this without the support of his commanding officer at the time. So he conducts this movement without any other authority knowing about it. But once they find out about it, they approve of it. But this is already after Grant had actually conducted it. And I don't remember I believe it was Fremont. John C. Fremont, who was actually the presidential Republican candidate back in, I think it was 1856. And he ended up losing that election. But John C. Fremont, for all of his, faults, the one thing he did right was bringing Grant on in the Western Theater, or I suppose at this point in time, it's still a part of the Trans-Mississippi. But either way, this at least gets the attention of his superior officer.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. As you said, it's Paducah's more of a movement by Grant, but there is a battle that happens at the Battle of Belmont. So, Nate, would you like to tell us about that, please?
Yeah. So Tim already had mentioned this, and that is, the city of Columbus was further south on the Kentucky border, on the Mississippi River. And right across from that is going to be a place called Belmont, where there's going to be a Confederate encampment there. Okay. Now, the river is shaped quite differently now, but back then, what that's going to look like is Columbus is going to, well, maybe Belmont will be easier to describe here. Belmont is essentially in the shape of somewhat of a salient as it goes against the river, and Columbus just sits right across. So Columbus is defending it. It has many guns, and there's going to be many soldiers there. Okay, and this engagement, it's actually going to bother Grant a little bit for the rest of his career, just because this is one that historians have always interpreted differently over time. But that's because there's a lot of speculation about who won. But again, context always helps in this case. So between September to November of 1861, Grant is actually going to gather intelligence from all over Missouri, learning about different Confederate movements and attempting to figure out where to best strike next. Okay. And Grant, of course, is already looking to take away the initiative from the enemy. He wants to go on the offensive. And he knew that Confederate forces could do little to reinforce each other elsewhere, both across Missouri and on the Kentucky border. Okay? And so he thought Belmont looked like a chink in Columbus's armor. Okay? So Belmont sat across the river on the Missouri side. Grant's intention was to seize Columbus through multiple movements that would go on at once, including his attack on Belmont. Okay, so Grant is going to order W.H.L. Wallace to move against New Madrid, and that's roughly 25 miles southwest of Columbus. And then Grant told Richard Oglesby to contact him while at Belmont, which indicated that he would have possession of a small Confederate camp across the river from Columbus at that time, because Oglesby would actually be on the he'd be operating still against Columbus as well. So it was clear that to Grant, the Belmont was a weakness in Columbus's defense because, Columbus is this big city. It's very well fortified, and here Belmont sits without any real fortifications. So obviously Grant sees this as an opportunity. He's going to take advantage of it. And so if Grant could actually establish a position close enough to Belmont, and then a threatening Union presence actually might convince Polk to abandon southeast Missouri. Now, we might think that's weird. By taking a camp, why would he, abandon the city? Well, Grant actually personally knew Polk from the Mexican-American War, and he did not think of Polk as a very aggressive or a very good commander. And so simply by scaring him, it is quite possible that he would have been driven out. So Grant is looking to exploit weaknesses, not just within the terrain, but within the person who is commanding that garrison itself. Okay. So Grant's going to arrive on the banks near the Confederate camp at Belmont. He's outnumbered, by the way, and outgunned. He brings up ships to transport his soldiers, but he does not have as many men as the Confederate soldiers do, but this doesn't scare him a bit. He's focused on his objective. He does have more men than those sitting at the camp in Belmont, but again, the Confederates could easily reinforce Belmont at any moment. Okay, but as they unload the men and advance against the enemy, Grant is going to leave a rear guard to protect the boats, and the Union forces on the advance will clear out skirmishers, and of course more intense fighting will actually begin to take place as they get closer to this camp. Grant is going to envelop the enemy force, forcing them to retire along the banks of the river and almost completely capturing them, but they don't quite secure a total envelopment of the enemy forces at this point. And sadly for Grant, this is where you see somewhat of that being put into command is still very new for Grant with this amount of forces. And when they get into the camp, he's going to lose control of his soldiers. They're going to start, raiding the campsite. I don't remember specifically who starts giving big public speeches and about victory and everything else, but Grant is going to order that the camp be burned and that they return to the boats, right? So now this is basically turned into a raid of some kind. Okay, so Grant, as they're about to leave the camp, uh, Confederate forces are going to be reinforced along the riverbanks by other Confederate ships. And Grant, upon seeing this, he actually tries to get the Confederate artillery to face out towards those Confederate ships because he wants to stay and fight to fire on those ships, but he can't get them in place in time before the Confederate soldiers start unloading from those ships. And as they unload, obviously the Confederates advance against the Union. So Grant sends the order, we cut our way in, we can cut our way back out. But so the Union soldiers, they're going to make a mad dash back to their own transport ships. And Grant was actually unsure if all of his regiments made it back. So he personally went back. He rode back out towards the Confederate camp. And it's kind of this weird moment that takes place in Civil War history where you have this young, well, maybe not young, but, a younger brigadier general. He's by himself on his horse, and he's now face to face with hundreds of Confederate soldiers, and they're looking at him and staring at each other, waiting for one to make the move. And Grant realizes, oh man, this was a bad idea, and he has to get his horse to turn around and head back to the ships as the Confederate soldiers fire at him. Amazingly, none of them hit him or his horse. And of course, there's the famous episode of, the transport ships are leaving and someone puts out a plank for him to ride up on with his horse into the transport ship. And he does, and he gives all the glory to the horse, of course. But, obviously this battle, it's really quite interesting to read about, but this is going to be Grant's first true engagement and true command of men as a brigadier general.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, this is the first time that you're seeing also the Union Navy combined with the Union infantry. Also, which obviously is going to play a major role in going forward. But also at this point, the other question today, sort of like a double-sided question: do they realise how important this river is at this point? These river networks. Sorry, sorry, I forgot what the theatre's called.
This one's awkward because because Missouri technically is a part of the Trans-Mississippi Theater, mm-hmm. But then you have Kentucky, Tennessee operating in the Western Theater. So I don't even really know how to label which theater this belongs into.
Okay.
But I understand what you're saying. In terms of the rivers, the reality is I believe not just Grant, but the entire Union command saw how important the Mississippi River Valley was, especially to Confederate forces, because they had all these different forts along all these different river networks, and control of that would give a huge advantage to the Union, and they were looking to exploit those weaknesses that presented themselves at places like Columbus, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, and then of course later on at Vicksburg. But if Tim has anything to say about these river networks, I'm more than happy to turn that over to him.
Not really much to add. Grant is probably the most vocal early advocate for focusing on the rivers. Largely, is evidenced by his seizure of Paducah, his desire to get Polk out of Columbus. But it's really after that as he begins to look at movement down the Tennessee that he really starts, to be honest, in a sense, being somewhat of a pain in the neck about the rivers with his superior officers.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, at this point as well, they're building up that good relationship with the Navy, aren't they? Because they need each other, don't they? You know, which is fantastic. And again, this battle is really early in the war, and November the 7th, 1861. This is really early. You know, this is before any of the the real major stuff that we hear of, and you know, it's a battle that you don't really hear that much about, really. But so, what did Grant learn from this battle? Did Union forces gain anything from it? We'll come to you first, Nate.
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple items I want to address. The first is, what you brought up here, Daz, especially related to amphibious operations. And that may be a unique trait about Grant, is how much, especially as a Army commander, he wanted to work with the Navy to bring about the end of this war. And it's not that in the past we had not had amphibious operations. I mean, you could look at the Siege of Veracruz, you could, even take a look at Yorktown, but the reality is Grant wanted this coordination with the Navy, and he had this deep interest in naval matters. If you look at the Battle of Trent's Reach later on in 1865, you'll see that he actually begins sending orders to the naval captain at the time. And even Horace Porter made the comment about how interested Grant was in ships. And then, of course, during his world tour, Grant loved looking at ships. He loved it. So you have this interest in naval matters in Grant. So that's number one. And you see that from the beginning here at Belmont. The second thing is that Grant, there's a lot of speculation is about why Grant attacked Belmont, and was he actually successful? Tactically, I would say no, but operationally, I would say yes, because his whole goal, and even though there's no evidence really indicating this, Grant will say it was to keep Confederate forces from reinforcing each other, but there was no evidence for that. So he really wanted to get at Columbus. He wanted Confederate forces to abandon Columbus. Okay, so even though they did not abandon Columbus, they sat idle. They didn't do anything after that. They didn't take on any aggressive movement or anything of the such. And what's interesting is I did find one source that does mention the fact that a Union soldier learned from a deserter in the Confederate Army that some Confederate officers were pushing to reinforce Arkansas from Columbus. I don't know how true this is, but if this is the case, then yeah, sure, Grant definitely stopped them from doing that. But Grant is going to develop his skills as an officer, and ultimately they will successfully destroy the camp, which was one of the main objectives. But he is going to make mistakes. The reality is that he wasn't prepared for these Confederate reinforcements from Columbus. And even though Polk hesitated on sending those reinforcements, the fact that Polk hesitated I think speaks volumes about how correct Grant was in reading Polk's intention as a Confederate officer. So Grant proved to be a very capable tactician, but he also proved that he had a lot to learn as well.
Tim, anything to add to that about what Grant learns from this battle?
Well, in addition to learning the value of close cooperation with the Navy, particularly Flag Officer Andrew Foote, who was, in essence, the naval commander there in that region of the Brownwater Navy. He learned the value of discipline, some of the limitations of volunteer troops, learned how quickly they could devolve into disorder. He also learned some of their advantages, their zeal. He learned a little bit about risk, and the trying to find that balance, because you need to take risks as a successful commander. And as a practitioner of what we would later, he wouldn't have known the term, but as a practitioner of what we've come to call operational art, a successful operational level commander needs to identify appropriate levels of risk. If you risk nothing, you make no progress. If you risk too much, you can invite disaster. Grant's learning a little bit about that. He hung his neck a little bit out there at Belmont, and was fortunate. To quote Napoleon, who he was not a huge fan of, he'd rather have someone that was lucky. And in this sense, Grant was pretty lucky to not have suffered a very significant defeat there. But at this stage, we have to remember both sides were pretty inexperienced. So,
But Tim, they modeled his tomb after Napoleon.
I think more people saw the similarities between the two than Grant did.
I like the fact that you brought up about the volunteers, because what people don't realise is part of the war, as you said, a lot of people are volunteers, and they're bank clerks and all sorts of normal jobs, and they all of a sudden they find themselves in this massive army. And this is really early in the war, and this is before this Western army becomes a really formidable force, which it will do, because it does become a formidable force under Grant and Sherman and all the other guys that come along with it. But yeah, so that's a great point. And also, they're not as well equipped as the Army of the Potomac, are they, out in the West? Is it a bit harder to get hold of the supplies and the correct weapons and all the things that go with a huge army?
Well, if you think about it, the center of, the War Department's centered in Washington, right there with the Army of the Potomac. So, in terms of uniformity, the Army of the Potomac, while there will be some differences in clothing, dress, zouaves, the Iron Brigade and its black hats and regular Army outfits versus everyone else in their forage caps or forage caps and shell jackets. The Army in the West will, generally speaking, be clothed by this stage and shortly after will be clothed essentially in blue, but they'll have a wide variety of weapons. Some will have Springfield, some will have Enfield, some will have Lawrence rifled muskets from, I think the Lawrence was German. So there will be a lot of disparity. There will be differences in artillery, a lot of, the best stuff. And almost all of the regular Army artillery units are going to be sent east. Or to the Army of the Cumberland, the army that Grant will operate most closely with for nearly 2 years, that would eventually become his Army of the Tennessee. Most of the artillery will be volunteers, and they'll be, they could get some assistance from federal arsenals in equipping these units, but they'll be volunteer units. There's very, very small regular Army contingent with Grant's forces for much of his time in the West until he gets, late 1863 when he assumes command over the entire theater.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah, and I'm going to bring in a real, the not so well liked character, I suppose you'd like to call him, is Henry Halleck, and he's sort of, he's a bit of a shifty character in my eyes, but other people might have other opinions. And so what is his relationship like with Grant? Because he is in command of this theatre at this point, isn't he? So, Tim, do you want to tell us about Henry Halleck?
Sure. A little background on him. He's a native New Yorker, was like the third of a dozen children or so, 12 or 14 children. Basically runs away from home, is raised by an uncle, attends some private schools, and then is appointed to West Point. He became a favorite of Dennis Hart Mahan, who was a military theorist who taught basically the course at West Point about operational art. I think I talked about that during our first episode about Grant. He performed very well in that, was actually allowed to teach classes while still a cadet. Graduated third in his class in 1839, so a few years before Grant. So would not have attended West Point with him. Spent some time teaching at the academy, working with fortifications, wrote a report for the Senate on seacoast defenses. Ultimately, he gave a series of lectures which were ultimately published in the mid-1840s as elements of military art and science. And he would later be the guy to translate Jomini's work into English. And he was well known as an admirer of Jomini, the French military theorist, or actually he was Swiss, but served under Napoleon and ultimately under the Tsar of Russia. But because of all his scholarly endeavors, he was basically given the ultimately intended derogatorily the nickname of Old Brains. He was very popular, though, among senior officers, most notably Winfield Scott. And if you were an officer wanting to get in or make a name, he was like what George C. Marshall would be. If you wanted to advance in World War II, be tight with Marshall would be your first step. It was the same way with Scott. So Scott appointed him a major general at the onset of the war, assigned him to command in Missouri. He was the fourth ranking officer in the U.S. Army behind Scott, McClellan, and John C. Fremont. And then 2 days after the Battle of Belmont, he assumed command of the District of Missouri from Fremont. Grant's relationship with him, Grant would have been known for his tough time in the Army after Mexico. He starts proposing, don't want to get ahead of myself, he proposes moving south along the rivers. And initially, Halleck blows him off, and he blows him off twice. So I wouldn't say that the relationship is negative. It's just that Halleck does not seem to value him the same way perhaps Fremont had, though Fremont had also kind of given him a somewhat cold shoulder when it came to moving further south at that stage.
Okay, thanks for that, mate. Cheers. Okay, so we're going to move to a couple of big engagements now, two notable ones. And so how was it decided that Grant should go after Fort Henry and then obviously Donelson? So, Tim, do you want to start with that, mate?
So Grant is looking at the state of Confederate forces in the Western Theater. And basically, unlike the Union Army, where you have Halleck in command in Missouri, you have Buell in command along the Ohio, and somewhat a fragmented command system, which will be somewhat detrimental to the Union. The Confederates are led by just one guy, Albert Sidney Johnston. Problem with that, or with Johnston's position, is his line is spread very thin, stretching, with Polk in the west along, from just about Arkansas, but there at Columbus, all the way to the east where you have Simon Bolivar Buckner in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Right in the middle, you have Fort Henry and Donelson. Fort Henry sits on the Tennessee River, Fort Donelson along the Cumberland River. But it's all they're very thinly stretched. Grant is, Columbus is a bastion. It's a bulwark that Grant could see the Union throwing forces needlessly at, and suffering needless casualties. But he thinks that if he could get control of Fort Henry, he could then open up the Tennessee. He may be able to then swing up the Cumberland to get Nashville, and in effect, basically divide the Confederate forces in half, basically force the withdrawal of that entire defense line, and seize what is in effect the heartland of the Confederacy there in middle Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
So he makes he makes the proposal to Halleck. He's blown off a couple times, but eventually Halleck warms to the idea and allows Grant to go forward in conjunction with the Navy. It's mandated they work with the Navy on it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what happened during the battles of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson? And we'll come to you, Nate, first, mate.
Yeah, and Tim, feel free to add anything if I miss any items, because I'm just going to give a very brief synopsis, and we can talk in as much detail as you want about it. But so the first fort Grant's actually going to go after is Fort Henry, and Fort Henry actually sits along the river, and it was Grant's intention of attacking this fort with both his army and the Navy. But the army is actually going to be slow to advance against the fort, largely because of the weather, the rains, the ground is muddy. It's just difficult to get up to the fort, but they do as best as they can. And luckily, the Navy is actually able to just pummel it into submission without really too much of a fight. This is going to take place on February 6th, 1862. And the Confederates will actually abandon the fort. There's a little bit of skirmishing. The Union will attack a rear guard of Confederates, but for the most part, the Confederates will actually fall back to Fort Donelson, those that are still from Fort Henry. Okay, so Fort Henry falls really without any problem. And Union soldiers are actually very surprised by this. Some of their accounts talked largely about how, the fortifications just seemed impregnable, like they just couldn't be broken. So they were shocked that this fort fell as quickly as it did. And I would imagine, to everyone's amazement, Grant, without gathering any reconnaissance or intelligence, he just immediately follows up on advancing to Fort Donelson within just a couple of days. And, one thing to keep in mind, Grant didn't know how many Confederate forces there were at Fort Donelson, and he didn't know how many he needed. He'll get some more reinforcements later from Lew Wallace, but at the time when he's advancing against Fort Donelson, he actually, again, is outnumbered. He does not have as many forces as the Confederates there in Fort Donelson. And as they're making their way east towards that fort, they're actually skirmishing with Confederate cavalry. And the weather gets particularly warm in February during, a couple days. So some of the soldiers are actually going to throw away their winter supplies to the side of the road just because it'll be less for them to carry, and they're going to probably hate themselves for doing that because a few days later there's going to be a terrible storm, an ice storm, where it's just going to be freezing cold weather. But when they arrive to Fort Donelson, Grant is going to envelop the fort. It will basically be about 7 miles of Union lines around the fort, and they're going to make a few advances against the fort just to test the strength of it, but they're not going to fully attack the fort. And over the next few days, it's going to last from February 11th to February 16th, where Grant is going to work once again with Admiral Foote, and he is going to try to figure out a way to force the fort into submission just by using the Navy, because it worked on Fort Henry. So what's the difference now here at Fort Henry? Well, there is a big difference, and that is Fort Henry sits atop a very high ridge compared to Fort Henry. So these shells that are coming from Fort Donelson attacking the Union steamers are just blowing them to bits. And I think there's only like one Confederate casualty in this minor engagement with the Navy. But even though the Confederate soldiers are excited that, their morale goes through the roof because the Union Navy retreats back from the fort, the Confederate High Command, which consists of, General Pillow, you have Simon Bolivar Buckner, they still realize that, they're still pinned into this situation and they can't, a siege, they can only be there for such a period till their supplies runs out. So they need to figure out what to do next. So their goal is to actually come out and attack the Union line to open up a road from which they can actually evacuate further east. So they'll actually come out of their entrenchments and attack the Union line, and they'll actually swing open basically the Union line, opening up that way. And Union forces will be forced to fall back. Lew Wallace, John McClernand, they're trying to figure out, what to do. And when the Confederates attacked, Grant actually is not with his army. He's actually with Admiral Foote, trying to, discussing the matters at hand as to, maybe we should try again, maybe not. But Grant hears about, his army being attacked. So, remember, there was an ice storm. So he gets on his horse and starts riding through this ice to get back to his army. And sure enough, he tells both McClernand and Lew Wallace, we must, retake our lines. And he rode off. And then he sent an order to another one of his division commanders, C.F. Smith, who used to be his old, one of his old teachers, and tells him, this is the moment we attack. Right? Because even though Grant is getting attacked in this moment, Grant can see through all that chaos, and he now knows the Confederate line now inside the fort has to be weak because they're using the rest of their force to concentrate their fire against the Union right. So he's going to tell Smith to advance and take the fort. So Smith, of course, does exactly that, and it works. And meanwhile, to Grant's advantage here, the Confederate command, high command, there's a moment where they actually don't know what to do. Even though this road is open, they don't know if they should go back into the fort to resupply or if they should leave. It's ultimately decided they go back into the fort instead of evacuating. So now your position is way worse than it already originally was. And so that's when, they eventually decide to give up and surrender. And that's when Grant, captures, thousands of soldiers. I don't remember specifically how many. I think it was something like 12,000 at Fort Donelson. I mean, it was such an impressive feat for Grant that, the rest of the country hears about it. And this is when his popularity really rises.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add to that, Tim?
No, I think that Donelson demonstrated, as I mentioned, Grant is an early practitioner of what we call operational art, and he demonstrated his fundamental grasp. We talked about common sense, and they just seemed to get this, as evidenced by his record at West Point. He understood a lot of these elements that make up operational art. He understood that Fort Henry and Donelson would be like the Confederate defense line center of gravity, we would call it, that point that would basically unhinge the entire line. They were also simultaneously decisive points that would enable that unhingement. And then, right after he takes Fort Henry and right across the river from Fort Henry was a smaller post called Fort Hyman. When those were evacuated, and ultimately they were very poorly sited forts. They were, Fort Henry was underwater within a couple days after, after its capture. And today it's at the bottom of a lake. So nothing really to see there. But immediately after capturing, Grant said, okay, I'm going to move on. So he kept up we would call the tempo, just the pace of operations, a high pace of operations. Ultimately, also grasping what the desired end state of all this was. The desired end state was basically to enable, to unhinge, as we would call it, the Confederate defense line, their northern Tennessee and Kentucky, and force it to fall back, opening up the heartland of Tennessee to Union thrusts, and also to enable movement down the rivers to further pressure the Confederacy. So at a very early stage in the war, it hasn't even been going on a year, Grant is demonstrating his fundamental grasp of these elements, and it'll continue moving forward.
Excellent, thanks for that. And just before we move on to a really important part of Grant's career, I do have two podcasts related to both battles. You have the Battle of Fort Henry and the Battle of Fort Donelson, which I did with a historian named Greg Biggs. So go and check those out. I'll put the links in the description below. Obviously, we have to give a brief overview of these battles in this podcast because, it's quite a lot to get through. But why did Grant receive that famous name, Nate? And you're going to tell us of unconditional surrender, Grant. Please tell us that story.
Yeah, so this is one of Grant's most powerful and prominent orders, coming from the entire war, really, which, he told Simon Bolivar Buckner, no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to immediately move upon your works. And just a very quick note, I didn't know this, but I was talking with someone that he served in the military for 23 years, and he served in places like Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Kosovo, and he told me that he saw this order actually as a poster on a ton of other American officers' like walls where they were currently staying. So he saw this all over the place. And I'm not, and I'm sure Tim could probably speak more to this, but I don't know if this just connects to the American way of war or the American way of waging war, I suppose, which is just kind of this domineering and just kind of unconditional fighting that takes place. I'm not sure if that just really inspires American military officers, but it's, I guess, based upon what this guy told me, is a very popular order among the American military.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thanks for that. And okay then, so what was the Union Army's next target and why? Tim, tell us about that.
So keeping with the, immediately after capturing Donelson, the immediate objective is to capture Nashville, its closest Confederate state capital. And ultimately that will fall. Grant will put pressure on it from up the Cumberland, or down the Cumberland, I should say. But ultimately the forces of Don Carlos Buell will seize it. Grant's forces are in the vicinity. But immediately after that, they begin to contemplate the movement down the Tennessee, with the ultimate objective being the Confederate railroad hub in northern Mississippi, Corinth. Grant, however, has, he's achieved the first significant victory, really significant victory for the Union. His superior, though, has a little bit of an ego. Will basically accuse Grant of not properly keeping him notified. Will, in effect, suspend him from command, or basically, he's in the doghouse. Very briefly, ultimately, he's reinstated. But that initial drive towards Corinth will be led by C.F. Smith, his former instructor at West Point. The intent is to capture Corinth because it is a hub where north-south running railroads will meet east-west running railroads, so therefore enabling Confederate movement from west to east and vice versa, not to mention north-south. And much of the Union drive will actually take place. There won't be any combat along that western stretch. Memphis falls essentially to the U.S. Navy on the on the Mississippi side, but there won't be any resistance to Union Army moving south along the Tennessee until essentially they reach what is in effect the outskirts of Corinth itself, which is where Albert Sidney Johnston, having been pushed back from the Kentucky line, falls back very briefly to Nashville and then ultimately continues on all the way to Corinth, where he begins to receive reinforcements from elsewhere along the Gulf Coast. Also, as far as Florida will send reinforcements, so the Confederates will start recuperating there.
And so the Battle of Shiloh, or Pittsburgh Landing, or whatever you would like to call it, is going to take place, and it's a 2-day battle, and it's a huge battle as well, very early in the war. Would you like to tell us a little bit about the start of that battle, please, Nate?
Yeah, so Shiloh, or Pittsburgh Landing, is going to display the best and worst of Grant as a commander. Again, the target was Corinth, Mississippi, and Grant did not believe the Confederates would attack his force there at Pittsburgh Landing. They were very ill prepared and not entrenched as they should have been. Even on the second day of fighting, Grant, failed to follow up the enemy properly after the battle. Okay. And although there's an argument to be made that Grant, along with many other Union officers, believed in what was called the decisive battle doctrine, which is a very Napoleonic way of thinking, where you fight a battle, and that, like a massive battle, and if you win it, then you come to terms with the enemy and you write up a peace treaty. So it's kind of like this one battle wins the war type idea, right? I mean, we see that at Austerlitz, we see that at Friedland, we see that at Wagram, and Napoleon is kind of the one that develops that battle doctrine. And many other Union officers continued believing in that doctrine later on. So he thought a victory at Shiloh would bring about the capitulation of the Confederacy. This belief, or this idea, was actually very, very wrong. Napoleon failed to grasp this concept during the War of the Sixth Coalition. So even though, he might have scored some really important victories, whether it was at Lutzen or Bautzen, the reality is that was only a temporary peace, and he's going to end up losing everything he had gained. Okay. That said, Grant's forces, they are going to be surprised on the 6th of April, 1862. And they're scattered throughout different camps and not concentrated with one another. We actually see the emergence of Grant's compatriot here, which is William Sherman. He's going to perform very, very well, despite being overwhelmed and pushed back. He will successfully delay the Confederate advance. He's actually going to be wounded during the fighting. And one of the qualities of Grant that is brilliant is that Grant saw this attack, and he realized he can trade space for time. Okay, so the Union soldiers were very green. They didn't have much experience when it came to battle. And another problem Grant is facing here is that, Lew Wallace's division was actually supposed to be used as reinforcements during this engagement, and kept telling his other division commanders, hey, Lew Wallace, he's coming. Don't worry. Well, Lew Wallace actually got lost. He actually didn't. He was far beyond where he needed to be. So that first day of fighting, they actually were outnumbered. Okay. So intense fighting is going to rage around what would become something called the Hornet's Nest, which, again, that was another area that was very heavily wooded. Union forces will hold back large Confederate forces that are trying to push the Union back. And a lot of those soldiers will actually fall capture to the Confederates. And in that time, Grant will establish something called Grant's Last Line, which was a very strong defensive position around the Pittsburgh Landing area. And Union gunboats will also once again support the Union Army by firing their guns at Confederate forces near the bank of the Tennessee River. Albert Sidney Johnson is actually going to be shot in the knee during the fighting, and he's going to bleed to death. And PGT Beauregard is actually going to then take command of Confederate forces, who they thought had done enough damage to the Union Army and believed they could finish them the next day on the 7th of April.
Tim, do you want to add anything to that, the first day of Shiloh? Because it is a huge, and also you get this, there's this view that Grant got surprised, isn't there? And so just give us a little bit of background to that.
Okay, so I actually welcome the opportunity because both Nate and I are what you might call Grantophiles, so we're big Grant fans. However, Grant would go probably till the day he died fighting against the accusation that he was surprised. That being said, unequivocally, Grant was surprised. Yes. You know what? You don't want your heroes to be flawless. Grant, he chose to make a decision that training was more valuable than entrenching. The Confederates were on their heels. He had reason to believe that he wasn't going to be attacked. Granted, he didn't have patrols out, and what he did have out was probably not far enough away. He, could have done more. That being said, the whole Halleck spat didn't help. He wasn't continuously in command. He had only got back to the Army relatively close to the battle itself. But that being said, he was in command long enough to, there on site to be like, hey, we need to concentrate. We need to, you need to have a division forward entrenched at all times, rotate them out to conduct drill or what have you. He could have done things like that. He didn't. So Grant was surprised. Mm-hmm. Bottom line up front.
Yeah.
Does that, the problem is people label that as a way to like, oh, Grant was garbage. Clearly, there were people surprised in individual battles all the time. How you react to that makes all different, all the difference in the world. May 1863, Joseph Hooker surprises Robert E. Lee, comes up on his flank. Robert E. Lee reacted. We don't say, oh, Robert E. Lee got surprised, to besmirch him. Now, that being said, someone will probably jump on that and say, start saying, oh, Robert E. Lee got surprised. Look at that. He's garbage. I think it's a logical fallacy. Grant performs remarkably well. I wouldn't even say tactically. Like tactically, does he make sound decisions? Yes, he builds, but it is a, Shiloh is not an operational battle for Grant. He didn't want it, didn't try to bring it about. What he did show was exceptional leadership skills, his ability to inspire, to be in multiple places. Some people dispute that, though why I don't know. The records are pretty clear that Grant was in multiple places. There is zero evidence, none whatsoever, that Grant was drunk at Shiloh. So that was thrown around because why else could Grant have suffered so many casualties? This officer, he got in trouble before the war for drinking, so he must have been drunk. And I mean, that will plague Grant, essentially throughout the war. And what is it now, 161 years after the battle, he continues to deal with it, 162 actually, deal with that accusation. But Grant, while like once again, it does not say anything about his quality as a operational commander, which is kind of where I focus on with my research. but it does show exceptional leadership skills.
Yeah, and again, I share your view. Yes, he is surprised, but again, it's how you deal with that situation. And let's be honest, the Confederate didn't break the Union Army that day, and the next day we'll see, the results of that. Obviously, Nate, you brought up a really good point just a minute ago about Albert Sidney Johnston being wounded and killed on the first day of the battle, and that is probably also going to play a factor into the second day as well.
Albert Sidney Johnston, he his death will definitely play a role, because Beauregard is actually going to pause. He's going to hesitate. He's not going to really push forward. He will initially try to attack Grant's last line. It does make me question if Albert Sidney Johnston would have pushed more heavily. I don't know, and I don't know if it would have been even any more successful. But it does definitely play a role within that as well. And just a very quick note on the drunken claim. I believe, and I could be wrong on this, but I believe that actually comes from newspapers after Shiloh. So that was something that the media put out there. And any, lost cause, revisionist history that claims Grant was drunk, I think typically cites those newspapers after the Battle of Shiloh.
Tim, what took place on the second day of fighting at the Battle of Shiloh, please?
All right, so towards the evening of the 6th, the Army of the Tennessee, or as it will come to be known, will be reinforced by elements of Buell's Army of the Ohio, General Nelson's division, I believe. Will start coming across over the evening. More of that army will cross the river and reinforce. Grant's original force will take the right of his line, basically along Owl Creek, which is the western border of the battlefield, while the Army of the Ohio troops will take the left side. And essentially what happens is day one in reverse. So the loss of Albert Sidney Johnston will really affect the Confederates in a number of ways, largely because Beauregard takes over, which is really ironic because the battle plan for what became the Battle of Shiloh was developed by Beauregard, but even before the attack was launched, after the much delayed march on Pittsburgh Landing, that delay caused Beauregard to lose confidence in his own plan. But what happens when Grant launches his counterattack across the entire front is the Confederates will basically be rapidly pushed back. They'll make stands in certain areas, once again near what the day before had been known as a hornet's nest. But the battle's, beyond doubt, essentially shortly after the onset of the counterattack. The Confederates can't hold anywhere and ultimately are pushed back towards Corinth.
Excellent, thank you for that. How did this victory affect Grant's popularity and rank in the Union Army, Nate?
Yeah, even though I think this is probably one of Grant's, greatest victories of the war, based upon, as we talked about, his reaction, this battle produced casualties for the United States that had never been seen before in its entire history. There's something like 13,000 Union casualties and 11,000 Confederate casualties. So therefore, there was a combined 24,000 casualties just for this, 2 days of fighting. And that was just unheard of on the American continent. So for Grant, believing in this decisive battle doctrine, he actually felt very justified, despite the casualties, if it meant winning the war quickly, because then you would eliminate all other future casualties. So he thought, it would be worth it based upon, if he could win this huge battle, the Confederacy will capitulate. Well, that's not what happened, right? The Confederates are actually going to retreat and live to fight another day. So we'll see, at Corinth and beyond. So once these casualties were actually sent out to the public, it was just horrifying. It was shocking to them. Okay, they couldn't believe Grant could actually lose so many men, despite what he gained during that victory. Okay, which basically also protected all of his previous gains before that. Henry, Donelson, it protected all of that. So this event gave Halleck the opportunity to essentially sack Grant or make him second in command, which is essentially just pushing him to the sidelines. Because what does second in command really do? Nothing. Okay. He had very little to say in operational and tactical decisions. He did make some suggestions on their move to Corinth and very limited operational decisions, but it would actually take months before he was actually back in the same role he was.
Hey, thank you, mate. What command issues did Grant deal with throughout the summer of 1862, Nate?
Right. So again, Grant's focused on trying to get back into command, and at one point he actually thought about leaving the Army, which Sherman, convinced him otherwise, luckily. But if we're, not talking about him trying to get back into command, he's actually going to take back his old role after Halleck gets promoted out east to general-in-chief because of, McClellan is going to fail in the Peninsula Campaign, and Lincoln is going to sack McClellan, so Halleck is then brought east. So because Grant is now second in command, he gets brought into command in July of 1862. And there's a problem, though, that he's facing, and that's the fact that he's now on the defensive, and which is something that Grant did not like. He didn't like being on the defensive, but it also gave the initiative to the Confederates. So his job is to make sure Corinth, Mississippi is defended against Earl Van Dorn and Sterling Price's Confederate forces, while also simultaneously reinforcing Don Carlos Buell's army as they're trying to take Chattanooga, Tennessee, which he ultimately fails to do. So Grant is having to give away his forces while also defending this miles long line of front, which is just anxiety ridden, and Grant even calls it the most anxious period of the war. So Grant is having to deal with that. He's dealing with, Earl Van Dorn and Sterling Price trying to aid Braxton Bragg's attempts to get at Nashville, to get into Kentucky. So Grant is dealing with all of that, and also he's dealing with Confederate guerrillas. It's just a total mess for Grant.
Okay, thank you. What led to the battles of Iuka and Corinth, and what happened during the battle? So Nate, we'll come to you first, please, mate.
Right. So Price and his men are actually going to go occupy Iuka, which is just east of Corinth. Okay. And this was after they attempted to support Bragg's initially his movement into Kentucky. But Van Dorn quickly realized that their armies were better off concentrated together and sent an order on the 18th of September to Price saying that he should make his way back to Baldwin, Mississippi to concentrate with him there. Grant and Rosecrans actually opted to attack Price's isolated force there at Iuka. Grant is going to left a decent-sized garrison at Corinth and made sure that they would fall back on the 20th in case Van Dorn made an attack on Corinth. So it's a mistake to consider Iuka a tactical Union victory because Price did soundly surprise and defeat Rosecrans on the field, but it's difficult to say where that blame lies. Okay, but I think it comes down to a very difficult operational movement that very rarely works because Grant and Rosecrans are going to work as a pincer against Iuka. Grant will be with Ord and his wing, and Rosecrans will move separately. And Rosecrans was actually supposed to be on two different roads as he advanced to Iuka to prevent Price from retreating from there, because Grant wanted to destroy this part of Earl Van Dorn's army. And the problem is that Rosecrans thought his army would be better concentrated on one road instead of two, so he's only on one road. Price will actually successfully defeat William Rosecrans when he arrives. He'll actually push him away from Iuka, and then he will be able to get on that road he didn't take and successfully evacuate from Iuka. So even though Union forces will occupy the city, it's ultimately a tactical Confederate victory there at Iuka. Okay, so and those two roads that Rosecrans was supposed to advance on was both the Jacinto and Fulton roads. Okay, so again, Iuka was occupied again by Union forces, but Grant realizes they're going to have to make their way back to Corinth because now Corinth is threatened once again. Grant will actually not stay with William Rosecrans' army there in Corinth after they leave Iuka, because it's possible that there was a really bad falling out between Rosecrans and Grant after that engagement, in which Grant just wanted nothing to do with Rosecrans. But it's also quite probable as well that Grant actually didn't want to stay in Corinth because he also had to oversee William Sherman's army that was in Memphis as well. So by placing himself back further, he was actually to communicate more effectively with both of his commanders at that time. So Confederate forces will attack Corinth not long after this in early October. And Rosecrans is actually going to perform, again, really terribly here because he's going to not be properly defended. The Union forces are actually somewhat scattered about in Corinth initially when they're attacked. Grant is going to do everything he can to get forces to come and reinforce Rosecrans, but they won't really arrive till the last day of the fighting. But luckily, Rosecrans' men will actually rally as they get closer into the city and push back, and they'll finally be able to hold off this Confederate advance, and Earl Van Dorn will actually have to retreat from the city of Corinth itself. But at one point, Rosecrans actually was telling his officers, and this is coming from a Union soldier's account that was there, he was telling his officers to actually retreat from Corinth, but luckily cooler heads, kind of ignored Rosecrans and just disobeyed that order entirely, because Rosecrans had ordered them to begin burning all their supplies and prepare for an evacuation. But these two battles really caused great anxiety with Grant. Grant actually will try to make up for it as he orders Ord to actually pursue these Confederate forces, and there's this engagement at the Hatchie River where the Union Army will successfully defeat the Confederate forces there, but they don't destroy them, which is what Grant wanted. So anyway, that's what happens for those three crazy battles.
Wow, yeah. There's a lot going on there. And this is also where Rosecrans and Grant really start to sort of dislike each other, is it?
Oh, they begin to hate each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And which will come a bit more evident later on, I'm sure. But yeah, okay, we're going to move on to the Vicksburg Campaign now, because the Vicksburg Campaign is important. And ladies and gentlemen, myself and Tim did an amazing podcast on the middle part of the Vicksburg Campaign, and I'll leave that in the podcast description. Go and have a look at that. That's really good. So, okay, what were some of Grant's initial attempts to get the city of Vicksburg? Tim, please tell us about that.
So Grant's ultimate drive on Vicksburg was really the second attempt. There had been efforts by Farragut, the Navy, to run the Vicksburg batteries. There was an attempt to make a canal to bypass Vicksburg that ultimately didn't go anywhere, though Grant will later attempt to restart that effort. But Grant's initial attempt, he goes with the most simple. A two-pronged advance, one overland, that he will lead with about 40,000 troops moving down the Mississippi Central Railroad, down through Oxford, the site of the University of Mississippi, ultimately trying to draw the Confederates out to attack him there. Meanwhile, he'll send Sherman's force. He's in a rush to get Sherman there because John McClernand has been tagged to command this effort. So Sherman will leave with 32,000 troops to move and attack Vicksburg over the by waterway. So they'll move down the Mississippi, up the Yazoo River, and come at Vicksburg from the northeast. Sherman will disembark at a place called Chickasaw Bayou and will basically attempt attacks against these fortified bluffs just north of Vicksburg and will be repulsed. Meanwhile, Grant's moving down the railroad. He's concerned about his supply line. He builds a supply depot in his rear at a place called Holly Springs. He moves further south towards a town known as Grenada. Meanwhile, on December 20th, Confederate General Earl Van Dorn will raid Holly Springs, destroy Grant's supply depot. Grant will be forced to fall back. Meanwhile, he starts and it is apparent that Sherman knew about this before he disembarked at Chickasaw Bayou, which took place 6 days or so later. But he still went ahead with it, thinking that Grant was going to continue south. The irony was that in falling back, Grant learned that the plantations of Mississippi could provide for his army, in extremity. So that was Grant's first attempt. He will basically then move all his forces over to Mississippi, just north of Vicksburg, and try to figure out another way. He decides that there's a couple of things he could do, but realistically, he knows what the right answer is. There's roads that move along the Louisiana side of the Mississippi. Problem is that this is December on the Mississippi, and all of those roads are up on the levees are flooded. So he can't use them, and he ultimately needs the Navy to get south of Vicksburg to run the batteries, as it were. And they could do that at any point, probably, but without those roads, he can't get there. So what's he going to do? And once again, at this point, I will defend Grant vociferously. What do you expect him to do? Sit there and do nothing? That's a sure way to probably get the axe, to lose your job. So he decides he's going to try what's known as a series of bayou expeditions. He'll try to go along the west side and ultimately make a juncture with the Red River. That doesn't go anywhere, though they cut a bunch of levees, forge a route. It is an option, but ultimately not one that will work. He speaks very promisingly about reopening this canal across what's known as the DeSoto Peninsula, right across from Vicksburg. Basically, you connect, you cut through the peninsula, open up the northern end, and basically you flood the whole thing, and then you bypass the batteries that way. Problem with that is ultimately there's strong batteries further south of Vicksburg, so you may bypass Vicksburg itself, but then you have other batteries further south that will be equally problematic. So Grant will say that he's optimistic, but truly I don't think he ever really is about that route. It's just basically a way to get people off their back. So the Lake Providence expedition on the west side and the canal on the west side, are no go. So he'll try a series, across, in the Yazoo Delta, known as the Yazoo Pass, and Steele's Bayou expeditions. They'll ultimately be foiled by Confederate fortification up that way, known as Fort Pemberton. So that doesn't work. But once again, this is just a way, what happens in a winter camp in the swamps, disease. In a way, you could argue Grant's keeping his men occupied, keeping disease down. That being said, disease ravages his army. But as you come up, into spring, those waters start to recede, the flood waters on the Mississippi, and these roads will be exposed. So Grant will decide that time is right for him to launch his expedition to bypass run the batteries, move a force south on the Louisiana side to well south of Vicksburg, run the batteries with gunboats and transports, only losing a couple transports in the course of it, to basically stage for a crossing of the Mississippi in a way to get around Vicksburg.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Excellent. Okay. So again, ultimately successful, and why? Tim.
So ultimately it's successful, one, because Grant really doesn't give up. He tried the most direct route. That wouldn't work. And to be honest, he retried it, knowing what he knew about the ability to subsist off of the land. It may have gone better, but it might have also been costly. His entire force could have then been met at some point north of Vicksburg by Confederates, and they could have had a slugging match all the way. Basically, these series of expeditions, while the Confederates were not needing to respond with large numbers of troops to each one, basically Grant's always mobile. The canal is happening at the same time that the Lake Providence expedition's happening on, north and west of Vicksburg on the Louisiana side. The Confederates have to think about that. They have to worry about their forces further south in the river, and Union troops driving up that way, ultimately under Nathaniel Banks. They have to worry about what troops Grant still has up on the Tennessee-Mississippi border. He has some strong cavalry up there, which he will utilize. He'll send basically a brigade under Benjamin Grierson to ravage the railroads in eastern Mississippi and central Mississippi. So Confederates are constantly off guard. Where's Grant going? They think he's focused on crossing north of Vicksburg, which is ultimately why, his movement down along the Mississippi side or the Louisiana side of the river, as I was, will be masked because Pemberton's looking at Grierson's raid. At the same time, Sherman's basically left up around his former battlefield up around Chickasaw Bayou in the northern defenses. So Pemberton really doesn't know where to look. And that's, probably the biggest factor which enables Grant's ability to get below Vicksburg, which enables his ability to successfully cross the river. The town is called Bruinsburg, where he'll ultimately be able to cross, and it's undefended. And once Grant's across, he's then able to do multiple things. He has avenues. He's, as he'll say, while it was risky, he, could not be more relieved. While the risk was there, he had a large enemy force between himself and his base of supply, which was still north of Vicksburg, but he was on dry land on the same side of the river as the enemy. And that was the first time since the overland Mississippi Central Expedition in late 1862 where that was the case. So yeah, he breathed a huge sigh of relief, and that's, at that point, that depending on who you talk to, and I'm of this, once Grant crosses the river, it's a fait accompli at that point that he will take Vicksburg. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, excellent. And we're going to leave it there at that point today. Anything you want to add, Nate, before we finish this episode?
No, I'll just very briefly say that a lot of this information that both Tim and I have actually got together here comes largely from the work of Timothy B. Smith and his work, especially on the Mississippi River Valley, where Grant operated. So that's where I used a lot of the references and material for this. It's excellent work. I really can't speak more highly of it.
And I mean, if you look at it, and I think it's worth noting, Tim Smith is building off of the earlier work of Ed Barr's. I dumbed down, months of military campaigning and into the essential elements. What you need to know about Vicksburg is that Grant, identified early on the proper route, couldn't do it, tried other things, and ultimately was able to go through with the route that he initially identified when he first laid eyes on it in December of 1862. It just took him a few months to be able to bring it into effect. But these campaigns, I mention that because these campaigns, Tim Smith wrote a multi-volume, 4 or 5 volume series. Ed Barr's 3 huge books, about yay thick, each one. It is a lot of information that goes into this. The Western theater is incredibly complex, and you can spend days, weeks even perhaps, talking about it and still have to learn.
I think it was Ballard that actually, in his book that analyzes Grant's generalship in the Western theater, he actually says at the very end of his book, when he gets asked about comparing Grant and Lee, he said that he can't comment much about, their generalship or comparing them, but what he can say is that Grant's difficulties in the Western theater far outmatched what Lee was dealing with in the Eastern theater. And that's where I'll leave it.
Excellent. And thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. We'll see you again soon. Cheers.
Thank you for watching or listening to the Figures of the American Civil War podcast. A big thank you to Dr. Nathan Provost and Tim Willging. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a big thumbs up and remember to hit the subscribe button. You can find links to all of our podcasts, including episode 1 of Ulysses S. Grant. For a more in-depth look at the Battle of Fort Henry and Donelson and the middle part of the Vicksburg Campaign and many more via our website. There you will also find blog posts, links to all of our social media pages. The links are available in the podcast description. A massive shout out and thank you to Cody C. Engdahl, who performed and allowed us to use his piece of violin music, Battle Cry of Freedom. Not only is Cody a musician, but he's also an author of a series of fictional novels set during the American Civil War. You will also find links to Cody's books in the show description. Alternatively, you will find them on Amazon. And Cody's latest book, he steps out of the American Civil War and into the Austro-Prussian War, The Prussian Prince, which you can also find on Amazon. All that is left to say is thank you very much for listening and watching to the Figures of the American Civil War podcast. Cheers.